Since your case study is all about spotting bias, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes, probably actually more than a couple, on exactly how to spot bias, what you're looking for. And I've already kind of covered the difference between fake news, which is earlier in the PowerPoint, which is news that is specifically meant to deceive. And that's kind of what you're doing your discussion board on. This is media that is specifically meant to try to spread deliberate misinformation. My biggest example of this whole fake news thing is the Pizzagate controversy, where someone started a conspiracy theory online that a bunch of people from the Democratic Party, specifically Hillary Clinton, had a child trafficking dungeon in the basement of a Washington, D.C., I think it was, pizza restaurant. Turns out that that was untrue. And unfortunately, this fake news was so prolific that a man actually went into that restaurant and threatened people with a gun and demanded to see the basement, only to find out that the restaurant didn't have a basement in the first place. So, that's fake news. And that's, sometimes fake news can be satire, sometimes fake news can be deliberate, sometimes it can be an honest mistake where somebody put something wrong up. But what we want to talk about today is more specifically media bias. And this is where you have a slant or a point of view that is being communicated. And we're all humans, we all have bias, and therefore a lot of media is going to have bias because remember, the media is made up of individual people. And, it's one of those things where there will be bias. As a matter of fact, this idea of objective journalism is actually fairly new. In the heyday of newspapers, most places had a left-wing daily and a right-wing daily, and their platform, or what specifically they were trying to communicate, was very much just part of who they were and what they were. As a matter of fact, this is the platform for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And if you read it, and this was actually etched in the stone of the building before they ended up leaving this particular building. They moved to a different one. But I mean, if you look here, it says that the paper will always fight for progress and reform, never tolerate injustice or corruption, fight the demagogues of all parties, never belong to any party, always oppose privileged classes. So, I mean, there is a definite, and you can continue reading it, but there is a definite agenda set here. And that is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about, a platform. And that's something that I think is really important to understand, is that most news sources have a stated platform, and you can usually find it by searching. It can be somewhat hard to find, but usually they have a mission statement or a platform that says, here is exactly what we're about. That's not, that is bias, but it's very, in a way that's the most ethical way to have bias, is to be informing your public. This is who we are and what we do. And however, this is a caveat, but that platform is only supposed to apply to the editorial section. All right. It's only supposed to apply to the opinion pieces that are written in a newspaper. And normally editorials are often unsigned. If they're unsigned, that means it's coming from on behalf of the paper. And if it's signed, it's a specific person. So, that's something to be keeping in mind of, when you're looking at how does a news outlet operate, look at their platform. What do they say? Okay. So if you're trying to figure out bias, another thing to look at is who owns the paper and what are their political beliefs. Because a lot of times a newspaper owner will control, or a news outlet owner will control and have what they call must carries. Many of you have seen the Sinclair Media must carry video about fake news and biased news, as a matter of fact. And that came from their corporate offices said, you must cover this story. So ownership plays a role in what is covered on the news, sometimes in bigger ways than we even realize. With must carries. Fox News had a monthly memo that would go out that would say, here are the main things the ownership of the channel wants to focus on and wants to promote. That's always going to kind of look at at somebody's biases. Sometimes also a good and responsible media outlet will let the public know if there is a potential conflict of interest. For example, a lot of times NPR, if they are covering someone who donates large amounts of money to NPR, they'll disclose that. They'll say, you know, we're talking about Monsanto, the Monsanto Foundation, or Bayer now, the Monsanto Foundation does donate to NPR. And so they do, you know, that's ethical. It's still, you know, obviously going to come through, but it is at least ethical. So looking at the platform and the ownership are two ways to kind of on the outside look at what biases are expressed. The next one is to look at kind of where stories are placed. And I want to actually take a second and kind of show you some this media bias chart. And there's actually a whole video that explains that chart on your PowerPoint slide, so I'm not going to go into it a lot. But when I'm pulling outlets to look at, I'm using this chart because I feel like this person did a great deal of research and quantifiable analysis to figure out what to cover. So what I did is when we're looking at our research today, when I'm going and kind of taking you on the tour of some of these news sites, I picked a kind of a skews left, a skews right, and a neutral or balanced according to this website. So you can kind of see where I'm pulling from, and I just kind of want you to be able to kind of see where I'm pulling this information from. So when you start looking at kind of stories in print, you know, there are ways to kind of look at what kind of bias you might be seeing. So if you refer back to the PowerPoint or to the video I talked about when we talked about newsworthiness, you can kind of see sometimes these things are because of newsworthiness, but there can be bias as well. So we're going to look at two sites, and if I'm good, I'll be able to get them side by side. We'll see how good my WebFoo is today. See if I can get you that. I'm going to try to expand this window just a little bit. I don't know if it'll let me. It's not going to let me. That's fine. Okay. So there's Fox News, and then we're going to look at MSNBC. And the reason I picked these two, where is it? It disappeared. Oh no, that's okay. It's just a quick Google away. Okay. So here is MSNBC, which if we look at our chart, it skews left. And then we're going to look at Fox News, which tends to skew right. So again, when we look at bias, we can look at where the placement of the stories are. We can look at where, you know, what the headlines are. And that's going to help you kind of define, you know, what kind of biases might be present. And for example, you know, we look at the front story here. And if we look at placement of stories, this top story here is about Trump, and in the Fox News, it's about Trump and his support of Boris Johnson as he's admitted into intensive care for the coronavirus. So you'll note that both of the top stories are about coronavirus. This one is definitely about, you know, Trump supporting Boris Johnson. And then this one is more focused on Dr. Anthony Fauci, talking about how, you know, things may not be the same again. And so you can really kind of see the difference here in which of the two, you know, which, you know, kind of where some of the biases lie. You can also look at how headlines are worded. You know, I can come here and look at, you know, some of the ways this is worded, and sometimes really see how different things are kind of talking, you know, how different news outlets are talking. And so, you know, here this says, you know, Trump sends support. You may not necessarily see that on MSNBC because they have a tendency to skew a little bit less in favor of the president. So I'm trying to find a similar, I'm trying to find that story here. And this is going to try to play a video, so I'm trying not to have that video play. There we go. So this one, instead of it talking about Trump and his viewpoint about how Boris Johnson is doing. It's more just telling us that the UK Prime Minister was taken to the intensive care unit. So you can kind of see just the editorial differences here between these two sites. You can also look at the way that headlines are written. One thing I thought was really interesting is early on, some of these were calling this the coronavirus scare, and other people were calling it the coronavirus outbreak. Obviously, if you've been kind of paying attention, there was also a kerfuffle about the, referring to this as the Chinese virus versus referring to it as the coronavirus. So I think that there is, you can really look at like how things are worded on these sites. According to the chart, the two most neutral sources are Reuters and the Associated Press. Really quick, Associated Press is a subscription that news organizations kind of all put into, and they upload their stories, and as a result, other people can download those stories and use them in their newscasts. And a lot of times you'll see like from the AP, for example. And so the Associated Press and Reuters are kind of listed on this media bias chart as the highest quality with the most reduced amount of bias. And here you see there isn't a whole lot of discussion over either Trump or really much about the British Prime Minister. It's more about the virus deaths. And then on Reuters, you do have him moved to the intensive care unit here. So you can kind of see how some of these things change in the way that they cover different stories. The other thing that you can look at is who they source. And that's going to be a little harder for me to show you today. But when you look at an individual story, what sources are they calling on? Who are those people? Like, what are the responsibilities of those people? One time I was watching a video and the one guest, very polished, very perfect. The other guest, who was representing the other side of the issue, looked like they had just rolled her out of bed. She looked rumpled. And, she was not as good of an advocate for her position as the person on the other side. And so sometimes choosing your guests really does influence how your story turns out. Word choice, like we just talked about, the introductory paragraph, the headline. One thing that's really important to realize is that reporters don't write headlines. Editors do. So a lot of times you'll see more bias in a headline than you will in the actual story that results. And that's kind of important because a lot of times people just read the headlines, right? And then also look at like what pictures they choose. I've got an example further down in the PowerPoint. And then what graphs and charts and how are those graphs and charts kind of called out? All right. Another thing to think about when you're looking at news coverage in general is how many minutes do they spend or how many column inches do they spend on something? If we look again here on the main page of MSNBC, almost the entire page is about coronavirus, almost the entire page. And if you look at something like the BBC, the coronavirus is covered here. But then you also have like, the bomb tests the true age of the world's largest fish, some deaths, celebrity deaths, and just some other things that are just not about the coronavirus. And this could be criticism. You could lay the criticism that because this was something that happened earlier on, that the British press is not treating the coronavirus as seriously as the American media. Or you could say, hey, there are a lot of other newsworthy things going on. Maybe this is what we should be doing. That's something for you to discuss in your case study. But, when we're talking about how much time do you dedicate to it? Sometimes there'll be stories that are front and center on one news site and have almost no coverage or just a tiny little note at the bottom for another. And that's really important when you're looking at, do I believe this source or do I have a thing? Also realize that there, again, two levels here. You've got Fox News. This is kind of their news site live. But then when you go to opinion, this is going to be their commentators. Commentators always have a very defined bias, and that's really important. And that's what commentators are for. They're supposed to put the media in perspective, and that's kind of what commentators' roles are. Same thing if you go to MSNBC, their commentators are going to be listed up here as well. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking through, as you're looking and watching, am I watching a news story or am I watching a clip from a commentary show? And that's actually one of the things when you look at the Spotting Biased broadcast that has a juxtaposition. It says CNN versus Fox News on a quote that Trump made. All of that is taken from their commentators, not from their news, like the news like readers. And that's important to realize. Okay. Another thing to think about, what graphics are being used when you watch a package. I'm going to pop, because Fox News actually kind of created these like these actual packages and these graphic packages where there's always the same graphic that pops up. And so let me see if I can just find one where I can post it, where I can have it up. See this America Together, for example. You have, that's going to be something that you may see. These are just images. Here's TV. There we go. So you can actually see that every single one has a very specific graphic look. Sometimes the way that they format these stories will have a specific kind of bias to it. You can look at the graphics packages. The flashier the graphics package, sometimes the more opinionated the story can be. Okay. And so that's just kind of what I want you to keep in mind when you're looking at bias. If you want some additional tools, I like NPR. I feel like they are they have a tendency in their commentary to be a little bit more, like if you look here, NPR has a tendency to be just a little on the left, but I feel like they usually do a pretty good job. I like to look at them for a lot of my news just because I feel like they cover a lot of stories that I'm interested in. I also think it's interesting that the Weather Channel has a tendency to just skew left a tiny bit. I have questions now. Another website I really like if I'm trying to really get all sides of a story is, unironically, a website called All Sides. This is allsides.com. And the thing I really like about this is they will actually go through a lot of these sources and they'll pull a story and then they'll show you a story from the left, a story from the center, and a story from the right. And so if you're ever really interested in kind of looking at a story from multiple perspectives, this is a great thing. All right. I want to close this out, and I know that I've been going on a while and I don't want to take up too much time here because this is kind of long. But I want you to think about, like, when you're going through your social media, and so I'm just going to go to Twitter real quick. You know, the stories that I am going to be seeing are going to be based not just on who I follow, but what the algorithm thinks I want to see. And so if you're only relying on your news to get your news from Twitter or from Facebook or Snapchat or whatever, you're going to end up missing out on more of the story. I follow a lot of writers, and so most of my stuff on here isn't actually going to give me a whole lot of good information. So I just want you to keep those things in mind. And like I said, I know this is a longer video, but keep in mind some of these elements, and I hope that that'll help you do your case study. All right. See you next time, y'all. Have a good day.